All right, we're back here to talk about the Red Scare that took place here in the United States as a result of the fear of communism. And we're going to talk about how the United States changed as a result of the Cold War during the Cold War. All right, so the United States and the Soviet Union are in this indirect battle with each other over world domination. Each side is trying to build more and more nuclear weapons so that the other side can blow its enemy up 3, 4, 5, 6 times over. And so people in America are afraid of communism, and it leads to what's called a Red Scare in the 1940s and 50s. Red was the color of communism. That's where the term Red Scare comes from. One example of this was known as the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was a congressional committee that was formed by Congress to investigate communist influence in America. And so people would call up and say, I think this person's a communist, and the congressional committee would look especially in government offices, and for some reason the movie industry became a focus of the congressional committee because of its influence on people. So people went out and saw movies, and so the movie industry became the target of this committee. And in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee launched hearings to expose these supposed communist influences in the movie industry. They branded actors and writers that would not answer their questions or refused to reveal names of people as Reds or communists. And because of this, people that were suspected of being connected to communism were blacklisted. And what that means is that if they went into a studio to try and get a job, they wouldn't be allowed to work. Or if they wanted to direct a movie, their movie wouldn't get made because they were called a communist. And so this is something that continues to keep that fear going in the United States, that fear of communism. I do want to show you one thing, though. If you look at this picture, this is a picture of the House Un-American Activities Committee trials. And the guy right here is probably defending himself and trying to defend his livelihood, his jobs, his way of life. And the guys right here are the guys that are asking questions, and they're the ones that are going to make decisions about his life. But I want you to pay attention to this guy right here. Notice how interested this guy is in the trials. Now, most of these guys would have been congressmen, but I think right there is a great example of how ridiculous some of these trials were during the 1950s. Now, other things that continued this fear of communists were spy cases. 007, James Bond, KGB, all those spy books and spy movies, they start to come out in the 1950s. Okay? And so those were based on real spy cases. The most famous of them was the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs were accused of stealing secrets about the atomic bomb and sharing them with the Soviet Union. They were found guilty by a jury and were executed, which means both of them were put to death for their crimes. Another thing that led to this fear of communism in the United States was in 1950, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed that there were communists working inside the State Department. Now, the State Department is is in charge of our military. And so McCarthy is making a big accusation here saying that communists are in charge of the State Department. Unfortunately, McCarthy had no real proof, and when people challenged his charges, most often it was journalist Edward R. Murrow, when people challenged those charges, he made up new charges. And this method of making these aggressive accusations without any proof became known as McCarthyism, obviously named after him. Now, in 1954, during these televised hearings, he finally went too far. He used brutal tactics and bullied a young legal assistant, and to the point where people around the country who watched these proceedings realized that McCarthy didn't have a whole lot of proof, and it made him look bad. And the public was outraged. Here's a picture of Joseph McCarthy. Here's what he looked like. So what happens to him? The Senate, which he was a part of, votes to condemn McCarthy's actions. So condemn is another word for like punish, or say that was a bad thing to do. Unfortunately, it came too late because a lot of people's careers were ruined by McCarthy accusing them of being a communist when they really weren't. But forever, still today, if someone makes false accusations without any proof, the news stations always bring up McCarthyism as the term to describe that. Okay, so Joseph McCarthy continued on with that, or continued to help lead that fear of communism in the 1950s. And there was a real fear because in 1952, America developed a hydrogen bomb, a weapon that was more powerful than the atomic bomb, the one that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By 1953, the Soviet Union had developed its own hydrogen bomb, and both countries rushed to build more of these weapons. Now, what really scared Americans, oh, and if you want to see the test of the hydrogen bomb, you can see it on the YouTube playlist that's connected to the Moodle page. You can also see some videos that the government put out to try and learn how to deal with atomic bombs best. In October 1957, the space race begins, because in October of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial space satellite. Now, the satellite didn't do a whole lot. It orbited the Earth and let out a beeping sound. Beep, beep, beep. It was the size of like an oversized basketball, and it had like 4 little antennas sticking out of it. But this caused a major scare in the United States, because the United States thought, or the people, civilians of the United States thought, well, if Soviets can launch this thing into space, could they also launch weapons into space? And nuclear weapons even. And that became very scary for American civilians, and people started doing, like, just as regular as fire drills, people started doing duck and cover drills because of the fear of nuclear war. In January of 1958, so just a few months later, the United States launches its own satellite and created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Here's what Sputnik looked like. Like I said, an oversized basketball with some legs hanging off of it. All it did was put out a beep, but it certainly changed the way Americans felt about their safety. All right, let's talk about America's economy booming in the 1950s. Along with communism and the Red Scare, you also have the fact that our economy is still booming after World War II. If you remember, the Depression happened before World War II. People were struggling, there weren't very many jobs. The war happens, and the United States builds everything for the war, Jeeps and planes and all that stuff. And because of rationing, people at home saved their money. And so people had jobs during World War II, and they saved their money during World War II, and they couldn't really buy anything. So when World War II ends, millions of Americans are earning more money than they ever did, and because they had saved more, they could spend more money than they ever did. And you have soldiers coming back from World War II who are young, who want to get married and want to start a family. And so all of these things lead to what becomes known as a baby boom, a significant increase in births. You can take a look here. These are some graphs that show the increase in new housing construction, in live births, and the increase in personal income. Okay? Advertising really went after women and men of the 1950s. You had to have the new gadgets that were there, the new dishwasher, the new refrigerator, the new television, which was brand new in the 1950s. And those kinds of things helped America's economy boom. People started to move out to the suburbs. By the 1950s, builders were constructing pre-planned suburbs all over the country. By 1970, more Americans lived in the suburbs than in the cities. Suburban life appealed to people because you could have space, you could have a backyard, you could have a front yard, and it was close to the city where many people worked. But there was some criticism about suburban life because it wasn't open to everybody. There was still discrimination going on. African Americans were sometimes, or often, not allowed to buy homes in these suburb neighborhoods. But the move to suburbs meant that cities collected fewer taxes, and cities started to go into disrepair because of that. But let's talk about the fun stuff about the 1950s, the television and music. By the end of the 1950s, nearly 90% of American families owned television sets. They didn't come around till 1945, really commercially. So in a matter of 15 years, 9 out of every 10 American homes owned a television set. Television allowed Americans to share the experience of watching the same news, the same comedies, the same sports shows, and American families watched about 6 hours of television a day. Now, it was very different back then. It didn't run 24 hours a day with 150 different channels like we have today. There was usually like 2 or 3, maybe even 4 channels that were available, and the television was on from certain times, like from like 3 in the afternoon till about midnight. Then it would sign off, and then it would play in the morning and the afternoon for a little bit, and then it would sign off until the evening. And so it was very different watching the television back then than it would be today. Now, music also changed in the 1950s. A new style of music reshapes American culture. Rock and roll sweeps the nation in the 1950s. Elvis Presley, 1956, 1955, 1956, those were the years that he got his start, and he very quickly became the king of rock and roll. We'll talk a little bit more in class about rock and roll, about how it not only was a big culture change in the United States, but is also one of those steps towards the civil rights movement as well. Teenage fans bought more than 70% of all records sold in the late 1950s. So some of the popular shows, I Love Lucy, you can see some of these televisions. This television is probably more closer to the 1960s than it is the 1950s, but you get the idea. Very different people watching the television. Before it used to be the radio, now it's the television. And then these are some of the music pioneers of the 1950s. There's Elvis Presley, of course. The picture here on the right is called the $1 Million Quartet because all 4 of these guys became big stars. Jerry Lee Lewis, he sang the song Great Balls of Fire. Carl Perkins, Blue Suede Shoes was his famous tune. And then, of course, you've got Elvis Presley, and then the guy behind Elvis Presley is a country musician named Johnny Cash. All became very, very big musicians. And then some of the other musicians of the time, you have Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Goode, Buddy Holly, you have Little Richard, and Ray Charles. And we'll talk a little bit about these guys in class in a seminar. So the United States, again, your learning target was to describe the Cold War's impact on the United States and the world, and to describe how the United States changed during the Cold War. So you can see television and music caused a big change in the United States culture. You can also see some of the effects of the Cold War as well. Hopefully you can take care of those learning targets after looking at this.